this war is one that will be taught for generations by other Western militaries, which are already sending commanders and officers to Israel down to the Southern Command, going into Gaza to learn exactly what the IDF is facing and how it exactly providing a response to this type of new warfare. They all fear that one day it's coming for them.
Shalom and welcome to State of a Nation. I'm Levy. When the framers of international law wrote the rulebook, they could never have imagined the kind of battle that Israel is fighting in Gaza right now. Dense urban warfare against a terrorist enemy that deliberately embeds itself in protected facilities like schools and hospitals, knowing it has a chorus of so-called human rights organizations and UN officials behind it, weaponizing international law, inventing whole new standards, just to pressure Israel to leave Hamas on its feet. Because the fact is, Israel is not only applying the rules of international law in conditions that no army has ever tried to apply them in, it's applying those rules and conditions they were never written to apply to in the first place. The eyes of the world are on Gaza and everyone is taking notes. Terrorists are taking notes, trying to work out whether hiding in the basement of a hospital will give them immunity. And Israel's Western allies are taking notes, learning how Israel is setting new standards in urban warfare. While media narratives focus on destruction and accuse Israel of all sorts of atrocities, those who understand military tactics recognize the significance of what the IDF is managing to achieve in a dense urban environment. Utilizing precision strikes, conducting raids on the basis of precise intelligence, all in a military landscape defined not only by what is above ground, but what's below it. My guest today brings to bear decades of experience on the field as a military correspondent, Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief, author, and now fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. Yaakov Katz has literally written the book on Israeli military tactics not once but 3 times, with more yet to come. He joins me in the studio to take us through the innovations of the IDF operations in Gaza and how, as he puts it, this war represents an unprecedented battlefield. Behind the sensational headlines is a complicated, messy, murky world where the professional army of a democratic state fighting a terrorist guerrilla has to make tough decisions using world-leading technologies and techniques adapted specifically for this unique terrain. In years to come, historians will look back at the October 7th war as a turning point in the history of military tactics and fighting terrorists in urban warfare terrain. Join us now for a sneak peek into the history books. Welcome to State of a Nation.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Yaakov Katz, welcome to State of a Nation.
Great to be with you, Elon.
One of the points of criticism that Israel gets, even from friendly journalists who are broadly sympathetic, is we don't dispute your right to go after Hamas, bring it to justice, bring back the hostages. We have questions about how you are conducting this campaign. They look at the civilian suffering on the other side and say, we think you're being indiscriminate or disproportionate. We have questions about how you're conducting the campaign. As we approach the 6-month mark now, since October 7th, how do you think we're doing in terms of how Israel's been running that campaign?
I think this war is one that will be taught for generations in military colleges, in war academies around the world, by other Western militaries, which are already sending commanders and officers to Israel down to the Southern Command, going into Gaza, some of these foreign military officers, to learn exactly what the IDF is facing and how it exactly providing a response to this type of new warfare. Let's remember, there's been multidimensional war in the past, right? If we go back, just as an example, to the beginning of air forces in the world, right? So there used to be ground forces, there used to be cavalry, then there was armor, then there was the air force suddenly, and then you could drop bombs. Now what Israel's facing in Gaza is there's the Gaza of above, there's the Gaza of below, there's the Gazan who you see who looks like he's a civilian, but actually is a fighter. There's a 16-year-old who someone might say, oh, that's a kid. No, but actually he's carrying an RPG. There are AK-47s, which we're seeing, and grenades inside the MRI room in Shifa Hospital, which we could start to talk about. Is it metal not supposed to be in the MRI room? But put that aside for a moment. Everything that we thought of what civilian infrastructure looks like, or how a military is meant to operate, how it's meant to distinguish itself, how it's meant not to use civilians, human shields, how what you see above is not necessarily what's going on below, or what you see underground is not what you see above. This is a new era for warfare. And the whole world looks at this and says, okay, on the one hand, yeah, we can be a little critical of Israel because, hey, why not, take a stab at Israel or give it a little hit like a piñata? But on the other hand, they all fear that one day it's coming for them. So they all have to learn how to fight in such a new terrain.
It's fascinating that you say that foreign countries are already sending their generals and commanders to learn from Israel, because one of the questions we get so often is, why are you not listening to your allies? They're telling you they're not happy with how the war is progressing. You should listen to them, take their criticism into account. And in fact, you're saying it's they who are learning from Israel at the moment, not the other way around.
I tend to make a distinction between what I hear from politicians and what I hear from military officers, right? Because these are two different professions, let's call it. A politician has political interests, right? We all know politicians. We all met with politicians. Politicians, yeah, they might know what's right on a moral level.
Well, they might. They
might. I say might on a philosophical level, but they have their own political interests. I think when we look right now, for example, what's happening between the U.S. and Israel, there's a lot of political interests that are in the mix right now. What's going to happen with Biden's future election and all that kind of stuff. When you talk to military officers, people who were trained, who earned their stripes literally on the battlefields of Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world, not here in Israel. And you hear the way they talk and how they're mesmerized literally by what the IDF is doing and the tactics that it's using. Let me just give you one small example, right? War is terrible, tragic. It's cruel. People die, right? Unfortunately, civilians also get caught up in the crossfire and also die. You also have instances of what we call friendly fire, right? Where Israeli soldiers shoot at Israeli soldiers. That happens when you get confused. In this war, the Israeli Air Force has been providing air cover for the maneuvering ground forces on the ground. So usually in the past, if I take you back like to the 2006 Second Lebanon War, which we're actually talking about just before, offline, you would have seen, so this is 2006, a bunch of years ago, but that's the last big war, when you had ground forces and the Air Force. The Air Force wouldn't attack a target unless they knew pretty much that the ground forces were about a kilometer away. A kilometer away, 1,000 meters. That's far, right? Why? They want to be careful that they're not. Now, why does that happen? Because we don't have the same level of communication. The people on the ground can't talk to the guy in the cockpit. All that has changed. And you have stories in this war happening all the time of where the Air Force is literally attacking targets. I'm talking about 50 meters away. Sometimes 20 meters.
As little as that.
As little as that. That shows what I know we're going to talk about, a level of precision that the Air Force and the IDF in its entirety are capable of, that sadly, the average person on the street has no clue of, doesn't understand.
And that sets the stage really for what I want to talk to you about today and pick your brains about Israel's phenomenal abilities of precision, and how we square that against the images that we're seeing on our television screens of extensive destruction inside Gaza. One of the points that Israel has been making in this war, in particular Dr. Ophir Falk, who's the Prime Minister's foreign relations advisor, that Israel is setting a new gold standard for counterterrorism warfare. It's dealing with conditions that no army in the history of the world has ever had to deal with, having to improvise new ways to deal with enemies that are deeply embedded in civilian areas, deliberately trying to use them as human shields. And even though it might not look like it now in the fog of war and with the over-the-top international media reaction we're seeing, when the dust settles, there is a lot that the world is going to learn from Israel about how you fight these wars in urban areas. Now, when this war started, you were working on a book, weren't you?
I was, yes.
What was the title of that book?
I had written a couple chapters.
You'd written a couple of chapters of a book called?
The working title, which I wasn't a fan of, I'll say straight up, but it was called Precision Strike. And it was basically going to tell the story of how Israel, in the last 20 years or so, has created the gold standard in what I call a precision strike capability. And just to give some context, historical context, there was one strike that really set the tone for how the IDF changed its counter-terror tactics, was in July of 2002, when there was, who was then the Sinwar of Gaza, was this man by the name of Saleh Shhada, who was arch-terrorist, big Hamas commander. Israel had been after him for months, if not longer. Would try to find him, couldn't find him. They finally found him. They had called off prior targeted killings of Saleh Shhada because he was with his wife or his kids or civilians. They found him one evening and they thought, bad intelligence, that the building and the buildings nearby were going to be empty. They dropped a 1-ton bomb on this building in Gaza. 15 people were killed, including him, 14 civilians. The world came crashing down on Israel. And what you saw happen in 2002 was Israel embarked on a journey of how do we ensure that another Shhada disaster, because it was really looked at here as a disaster, does not happen again. And you saw a journey with 3 tracks. The first was tactics. What are the tactics I can use to ensure precision? The second was technology. What technology do I need? What weapons? What platforms? What surveillance equipment? What do I need? And 3 is intelligence. It's not enough to know the city the person's in. It's not enough to know the building the target's in. It's not even enough to know the floor the target is in. I need to know the room. I need to know who else is in the room. I need to know what happens when I drop the bomb through the window into the room, the dispersion of the shrapnel and the munitions. I need to know everything. And then I'll take you forward in time to 2019, 2020, some of our prior to this war Gaza operations, where you literally had Israel dropping a bomb into a window, onto a bed, killing an Islamic Jihad terrorist like Baha Abu al-Atta. And his kids in the room next door, I don't know what happened to them emotionally, but physically, they were okay. Or in the summer of 2022, right before when the Lapid-Bennett government came to an end, we had a short 3-day operation against Islamic Jihad. They literally dropped bombs on a special angle through the 7th floor to penetrate down to the 6th floor, to be able to detonate in the 6th floor so only those people would get killed. Things that no other military in the world does. That was what the book was going to be about. In my eyes, a fascinating topic. Obviously, when October 7th happened, had to shift gears.
And why did that shift gears?
Because I think that for the world, I still stand by the story. I have no doubt that this story is valid and true. But for
because the idea that Israel has moved on from needing a 1-ton bomb to take down a building in order to take out a wanted terrorist, to being able to fire through a specific window in order to hit a particular bed, is a phenomenal degree of precision that, for people watching the images on our screens, doesn't seem to jive with what is happening now.
Right, and they're saying, so why aren't you doing that in Gaza all the time, right? Now, there are answers to that question, obviously. But let me throw out one statistic to our listeners and our viewers. The Air Force alone in the last almost 6 months has dropped. It's difficult to get the exact number, and ahead of this conversation, I reached out to some IDF sources. We're looking at about 40,000 plus munitions that have been dropped on Gaza. Now, you got to think, each of these bombs has the potential to kill lots and lots of people, right? So if we've dropped 40,000 bombs on Gaza, wouldn't you expect the damage also, the casualty death toll? And I don't want to minimize the loss of civilian life, which is always going to be a tragedy, but shouldn't it be more than it actually is claimed to be, even by Hamas itself? So, you know...
And that certainly speaks a great deal to, first of all, putting paid to the idea that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians or trying to perpetrate a genocide if you have fewer than 1 dead person for every bomb that is dropped. But even for the idea that Israel is being careless, because it does speak to a phenomenal degree of precision to drop that much firepower.
In such a small place.
In such a small, densely packed area, as we keep getting reminded, and not to have far higher casualty numbers.
100%. But when you try to explain that to people, and they see these images, it's hard to jive, as you said, or make that, add up. Which meant, I understand that, and that required a pivot. And the book is now going to be about a different topic, although including these elements, it's going to be about this war, which will of course include these elements of how this is an unprecedented battlefield, how this is a war the likes of which have never been fought before, and how the IDF is answering.
And we'll get to that in a bit, because I want at the end of the podcast episode, and of course we want people to listen all the way to the end to give them a teaser as to the book, but I want to jump back to that question that you asked, saying if Israel has these phenomenal precision capabilities, and we know that they're being precise with the munitions that are being dropped, because this could have caused significantly more damage if Israel were being careless. But if Israel has this ability to reach a terrorist by firing a munition through a particular window into a particular bed, why isn't Israel doing that? That is the sort of question I might get asked on TV.
You know, I could tell you, for example, the Baha Abu el-Ata strike, which goes back to the end of 2019, right? And Israel puts that missile, an F-15 drops this bomb through the window. Actually did a huge deep dive into that story because it fascinated me. I saw that really as a pivotal moment. And I met with the Air Force commanders, and I met with the commanders in the Southern Command, and I met with obviously the politicians, but I also went to intelligence headquarters not far from where we're sitting right now, and met with the team that they have in a unit called 9900, okay, which is, everyone's familiar with 8200, the SIGINT, you know, the wizards of the IDF. These are a 9900, they do what's called VISINT, visual intelligence. They have teams there that what they do, it's made up of architects, civil engineers, people who understand in design, in different materials. How thick is the wall? What's the bars made of? If there's an air-conditioned external unit, can the bomb penetrate? What type of weapon do I need? What is the building? Where are the rooms? What's the layout inside? We don't know, but they can figure all this stuff out with their knowledge. Incredible detail of what you need to have. Now that's possible when you're planning one strike and one operation to take out one bad guy who's doing a lot of bad. When you're at a war that was unprovoked, that an assault the likes of which we have never seen against the state of Israel on October 7th, and you are now forced and compelled into a battle, you have to fight to defend your country and defend your people and secure your borders. And for people to expect, by the way, that same level is of course not possible in any world, but still with that, what the IDF does before attacking any single target, each target, there's a piece of paper like this. You might have seen it within the military. It has on it, what's the target? How is it going to be engaged? Air Force, ground forces? Is it going to be by the Navy? How is it going to be attacked? What's the type of munition? What do the commanders say? What does the intelligence say? What do we say about potential civilian casualties? And what do the legal advisors say about these? These are all targets that you prepare ahead of time, target banks.
This is as opposed to soldiers who are on the ground and have an RPG
engaged,
fired at them and they engage.
And they have to automatically. These are targets that mostly would be bombed by the air ahead of time as part of a plan. But that is a level of detail that you don't have to, I mean, forget about who am I? Ask military commanders in the US or in Europe. No one does anything like this.
Why not? Why has Israel developed these phenomenal methods of precision that other militaries haven't? What was the operational need that drove the ability to innovate these new forms of weapons?
I don't think it was an operational need. From what I've come to think is it really stems from two primary interests and motivations. But I want to talk about the most important one. And that is our morals. It really is a Jewish way of life. People will scoff, they'll laugh, they'll be like, nah, come on. It is. We sanctify life. It's a crazy thing. The fact that we're talking 6 months into a war, how many hostages are we going to get back, right? I always say to people, when you think about the hostages for a moment, how many are alive? We don't know. They're talking about maybe getting 40, 50 out. Ceasefire for 6, 7 weeks. Rationally, that makes no sense. You're about to destroy Hamas potentially, and you're going to stop the war for 40 people? Does that make sense? Who would think to do that?
To my Jewish mind, it absolutely does.
Exactly. But to your Jewish mind, it makes sense because we value every single life. So the same way we value the lives of our own people, we also value the lives of their people. And it's not me who says this. Golda Meir, right, her famous line is the moment they start to care about their children the same way we do, we won't have, paraphrasing here for a moment, but there will be peace. There won't be a need for war. It comes and it really stems from that value and that sanctity of life. The second motivation, and you know this from the countless interactions that you've had since October 7th with the international media, we are judged and evaluated in a very different way than the rest of the world.
Right. No other military in the world is asked to give an accounting of the velocity of every single bullet in real time during a war.
No, and no one is asked to do the things that are expected of us, whether it's with humanitarian aid, whether it is in the way we fight, whether it is with the flyers and the millions of pages that we drop from the Air Force, whether it's by sending you a map, you, a Hamas guy in Gaza, and saying, hey, we're going here, so you should probably go there. I mean, what military gives up the element of surprise?
And we do it not because we think it's going to earn us brownie points on Sky News or CNN, but because it's important for us and our national conscience and how we wage war.
Because we know it won't, right? And we know that we'll send out Levy to the front lines of that media battle, and he'll do the best he can to push back, and he does a great job. But we know that's not what's going to win. We do it because we believe in it. And you could say it's crazy, and I've had people who have said to me, you know, this is nuts. Why do we fight this way? But that is the way
the Americans said, we've been telegraphing our punches.
Yes.
Was the phrase. Yaakov, I want to go back to that famous Golda Meir phrase saying, peace will come when the Arabs love their children more than they hate ours. Attracts a lot of criticism from outside observers, people on the pro-Palestinian side, for suggesting that Palestinians don't care about their children. But the sad fact in this war is that Hamas has been deliberately using humans as civilians as human shields, embedding their military infrastructure under civilian areas, with all the tunnel shafts poking out inside homes and schools and hospitals. And I'm wondering, despite Israel's precision capabilities and the steps that go through in selecting each target, nevertheless, how we explain the extensive damage that we've seen to civilian infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip in terms of Hamas's human shield strategy.
There is extensive damage, and there's a tragedy that has taken place in the Gaza Strip, and we should be cognizant of that. If you ask me, it's because of Hamas. Hamas is to blame. It's not us. We are doing what any military in their right mind would do that wants to provide the security that it needs to provide, right? The question really has to be is, why is Hamas using every school, every hospital, every home, every shopping center as a launch pad or as a command center or as a weapons storehouse? I mean, look at what's happened just in the last few days at Shifa Hospital, right? It's remarkable. We have rounded up hundreds, close to 1,000 people that we have captured inside Shifa Hospital, that the IDF has captured.
Including some very high-profile targets.
Who are registered card-carrying, as much as you can be a card-carrying member of Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
Yes, I had an interview once. I said they're card-carrying members of a terrorist organization. Right. And he pushed back and he said, do you mean they're literally walking around carrying cards?
It's like
I said,
Costco
no, it's
cards.
A figure of speech. Obviously, it would make it easier to identify them if they were literally carrying cards.
But they are as card-carrying as you can be. Not to mention those that we have eliminated without, as we're speaking, harming civilians inside the hospital. But you watch the interrogations of these terrorists, which the IDF has in the Shin Bet have now put out. And they talk about how, the maternity ward, that's Islamic Jihad territory. We got the special surgery ward. That's where us Hamas guys take. I mean, that's not normal. And any of our listeners and viewers, I'm sure some of them have sadly, or in good reasons, have been to hospitals, have had to have an MRI done. I once had one on my knee.
A maternity ward, when they speak about deliveries in maternity wards, it's usually deliveries of children, not deliveries of weapons and RPGs.
I mean, this is something that's abnormal, right? That is why, unfortunately, when you are going after targets, you're going to have to take out civilian targets. Now, international law, I'm not an international law expert. But once a civilian piece of property or infrastructure starts to take on the use of military for military purposes, it becomes a legitimate target. Then you get into questions of...
Under the Geneva Conventions, a medical site may lose its special protections once it is used for military purposes. It doesn't mean that you can declare open season on it. Of course, the IDF is still obligated by all the other rules of international law, but it may lose its special protected status if it's being used as a military
hospitals,
base.
Homes, schools, all these buildings, they then become legitimate targets as long as you meet the proportionality test, which the IDF is meeting. And you see that, by the way, in the death toll numbers, right, of how the IDF is meeting the proportionality
And I
test.
want to get onto that in just a bit, but I want to talk about some of the damage that we're seeing inside Gaza. I'm running through some interesting analysis that I saw from Salo Eisenberg, who's a board member at Honest Reporting. Does terrific work taking a deep dive and doing the work that I think some journalists should be doing, really, and scratching below the surface instead of taking what certain UN officials will say at face value. Because the headlines that we've seen in this war have been that there has been more widespread destruction than the Allied bombing of Germany, that Gaza has been completely leveled, destroyed, and actually that's belied by the UN's own figures. So I want to have a conversation now about how UN officials, agencies end up laundering Hamas talking points and the media ends up running along with it, and we'll show how some of you've been engaging with that in the international media as well. Fascinating analysis from UNOSAT, a UN office that uses satellite imagery, from middle of March 2024. And it points out that 12% of buildings in Gaza have been destroyed, 7% severely damaged, and 16% are moderately damaged, and that's defined as no or minimal visible damage, so that the building is still standing. So in total, according to UN satellite analysis, we're talking about 19% of buildings in Gaza have been badly damaged or destroyed in the course of this war, which is of course a lot, but it's far less than what Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territory, says when she claims that 60% of Gaza's buildings have been destroyed or severely damaged. Albanese, of course, the UN official who's been called out by France and Germany for denying the anti-Semitic nature of the October 7th massacre, consistently running interference for Hamas in this war, claiming 60% of Gaza's buildings, Gaza's homes at least, have been destroyed or severely damaged. Now, Salo runs this very interesting analysis. He has a look at where is she getting these numbers from. And it turns out she's citing a UN OCHA report. And the UN OCHA report quotes, wait for it, the Ministry of Public Works and Housing, which is a Hamas ministry. Mm-hmm. Here you have Hamas, puts out a press release, the UN copies it, puts in small print that this is a Hamas figure, and then the UN's own officials will quote a report based on Hamas propaganda as opposed to their own analysis. And that's the source of the headlines that we're seeing. You know, the AP, for example, claiming that Israel's military campaign among the most destructive in recent history, outpacing Allied destruction in Germany, certainly taking things out of the context of other counterterrorism wars. If you look at
and
the
you
same...
know what? The UN says it.
The UN says so. But look, the UN also says that an estimated 80% of buildings have been rendered uninhabitable by US and Allied action in Raqqa in Syria, and a similar sort of damage in Mosul as well. I mean, the damage in Gaza reminds me a lot of what the 86 nations did to Mosul and Raqqa in order to make sure that they could dislodge ISIS. And so here you have, even though there is a lot of damage inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas talking points being laundered by the United Nations, going straight into headlines that are then quoting the United Nations, which is quoting Hamas. And that becomes an established fact that then puts diplomatic pressure on Israel, even though it's detached from reality and the UN's own analysis. How do you, as former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, think about what is going on here and how that information is being laundered to give the false impression that Israel is being careless? And of course, the same Albanese person then horrifically and libelously accusing Israel of genocide on the basis of Hamas propaganda.
Can I tell you, you know, there's a lot of things that have been driving me crazy about this war, but...
All of us, Yaakov, all
of us. I know I'm not alone. But if there's one thing, it is the way that you have international organizations, whether it's the UN and even world leaders, who will parrot what Hamas says as if it is coming from the Holy Grail. You just brought the perfect example from the Ministry of Public Works or Construction or Housing, whatever it is in Gaza. But you see President Biden, who, for example, throws out the 30,000 casualty number.
Even though the Pentagon has already clarified that these are Hamas figures and the US has no independent assessment of the casualty numbers.
The WHO head, the World Health Organization, everywhere around the world, they just take it as if it is the gospel. And you and I both know that, you know, if this was Al-Qaeda who was saying, you would never have a US media, you would never have AP or anyone else in the world who would say, the Al-Qaeda health ministry claimed or the ISIS construction ministry claim. No one would ever take what they said.
But they weren't national resistance.
Right, no, they were terrorist organizations.
Unlike Hamas.
Hamas, in other words,
and it's freedom rapists.
Right. There we'll believe them. But we won't believe, it's one of the most blatant double standards that you will ever see. And it every single time I see it, it blows my mind. And the fact that people continue to accept this as truth, I think sadly what it speaks of also about the media, unfortunately, we can't believe what we are consuming in the mainstream media today.
It's a problem, and it's a problem not just of media quoting UN officials as if this is gospel truth. I think there's something a little bit more sinister happening here in terms of how the numbers are laundered and twisted against Israel. I want to show you an example here. I want us to unpack together from CNN a few months ago. I was surprised by this headline, and of course, the lead is always buried.
Of course.
And when I was doing the daily press conferences, I had a team helping me go through the international media. I said, look, I need you to help me find the information that is buried in the middle of the report, because it's always in the middle of the report. It's never the headline. So let's have a look at what the headline was, and then we're going to dive down into what happened. This is a CNN report alleging that about half of the bombs that Israel has dropped in Gaza have been dumb bombs, which would seem to suggest Israel is being careless and indiscriminate. Let's watch this clip from CNN.
Up to 45% of air-to-ground munitions Israel has used in Gaza are the so-called dumb bombs. That is according to the latest US intelligence assessment, described exclusively to CNN by 3 sources who saw it. The unguided or dumb bombs are less accurate and more likely to cause civilian casualties.
Now, this caused us a lot of grief because, of course, Israel is saying we're being targeted, we're being precise, and here is US intelligence saying, no, Israel isn't being precise. Let's have a look at how that story appears on the CNN website, where we have the headline, exclusive, nearly half of Israel's munitions dropped on Gaza are imprecise dumb bombs, US intelligence assessment finds. And for my sins, I didn't get down to paragraph 12 in time to neutralize this crisis, but let's see what paragraph 12, 13, 14, somewhere deeply embedded in the thing shows us. A US official told CNN that the US believes the Israeli military is using the dumb bombs in conjunction with a tactic called dive bombing, or dropping a bomb while diving steeply in a fighter jet, which the official said makes the bombs more precise because it gets closer to its target. The official said the US believes that an unguided munition dropped via dive bombing is similarly precise to a guided munition. I'll say that again. The US believes that an unguided munition of the sort that Israel has supposedly been dropping indiscriminately over Gaza, dropped via dive bombing, is similarly precise to a guided munition, and I am hitting my forehead wondering, why is the headline of that story not US assessment, Israel is striking Gaza in a precise fashion?
Correct. With the greatest precision. Yes.
Because that is what their own information says. Yes, they're using this thing that if you were to drop it from a plane flying overhead would be imprecise. But your own source that is giving you the headline is telling you Israel is dropping these weapons in a manner that is just as precise as a guided munition. So why is that not the headline?
Because they want...
I'm venting at you as the representative of the media.
I was not the one who chose this headline.
No, you were not.
But they want the image. And we can all see it in our eyes, in our minds of, World War II, Vietnam, carpet bombings of different places.
Doesn't help that Israel doesn't actually have carpet bombings.
That's what they want people to think we're doing. But that is not at all what Israel does. It's not the way we wage war. It's not the way we fight. It's not the way we target. And if we were doing that, things would look a lot differently. And that's what people fail to realize. But this is part of this bias and this double standard, Elon, that you see every day in those interviews that you're doing, that I don't know the right answer of how we fight against that except to keep on punching away and telling the truth.
As a former editor of a newspaper, what advice would you give to people wondering how to consume media in a more intelligent, critical manner and be skeptical about what they're seeing and how that information is being packaged for their consumption?
First of all, you can't just consume one media outlet. You have to look at a number. And you have to, unfortunately, in today's reality, there isn't one source of credible information, not like, the Walter Cronkite of the world that doesn't exist anymore. So you have to read. If you read the New York Times, you got to go somewhere that also looks at things from a more right-wing conservative perspective. If you're going to read Haaretz, let's say, which is a more left-leaning newspaper in this country, go read the Jerusalem Post or Times of Israel, which are a little more centrist, right? You have to take a broader perspective to the media. Now, the problem is that all this takes time. All this requires some in-depth need or desire to want to read and learn and educate yourself and know more. And most people don't want that. Most people, it's enough the Instagram or the TikTok post or video or whatever it is that they're getting. That is what they will get their information on, and that tells them the whole story.
And that information is going from the headline and not from the buried lead. We mentioned the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Gaza as a result of Hamas deliberately embedding its military assets inside and underneath them, rendering them legitimate targets under international law. I want to talk about the civilian casualties because it's horrific.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrific.
It is.
It's genuinely very sad. And when I give interviews and they ask, how many is too many? I say, look, too many people were killed the moment Hamas crossed the border and unleashed this horrific spree and forced us to go back inside in order to bring them to justice and bring back the hostages. This can end if Hamas ends now. Like, we don't want this. But the civilian casualties are heartbreaking. But let's have a look at the numbers and try to put this within the broader understanding of the history of warfare, specifically this type of warfare, and the challenge that the IDF is facing. The challenge the IDF is facing in trying to uphold international law in circumstances that not only was international law not written for, but no army in the history of the world has ever tried to apply the rules of international law in an area where terrorists are so deeply embedded, are using and manipulating civilian facilities, backed by a chorus of so-called human rights organizations that will weaponize international law in order to constantly twist it against Israel. And one of the challenges we're seeing here is with the very upsetting civilian casualties. Let's take a look at an interview that you had with CNN where you were asked. It's a bit old, so the numbers are a bit out of date, but let's see how you answer this question about the casualties inside Gaza.
It's a very good point. And as far as Israeli ground operations in Gaza, they're now expanding into a number of large refugee camps in the central part of the Gaza Strip. This is a sort of urban fighting, which can be especially deadly for civilians as well as soldiers. So after 82 days of war, the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza says 21,100 people have been killed so far, an average of 257 a day. So just very quickly here, Israel, for the most part, doesn't dispute the overall number of people killed, but rather how many civilians were killed and how many are actually Hamas jihadis, right?
Israel looks at it a little differently. They say that about 6,000 to 7,000 are Hamas or Islamic Jihad fighters. So when they look at it, there's actually a ratio of combatant to civilian of 1 to 2. And if you were to look, John, at throughout history, if you include World War II, if you don't include World War II, that ratio, while tragic and horrific, and every loss of life is a tragedy, that is within the realm of actually what would be considered in combat, in urban warfare, to actually be, unfortunately, and I hate to be saying this, to be a good ratio for this type of warfare. And Israel, we have to remember, is doing everything it can to try to minimize those civilian casualties. And who's responsible is the way Hamas fights and how it defends itself and surrounds itself with these civilians.
The phrase good ratio doesn't sound good.
No.
It's horrific. I mean, like,
that's why I apologize like 3 times.
No, and it makes sense, but war is an ugly business. And when the United Nations says that in recent history, urban warfare sees 9 civilians killed for every 1 combatant, a civilian to combatant ratio of 9 to 1, 90% of casualties in wars being civilians. And here, even if you accept the Hamas figures, we're talking about a civilian to combatant ratio of around 1.3 to 1, when you take into account that many civilians will have been killed by the thousands of Hamas rockets that have misfired and landed inside Gaza, like with the Al-Ahli hospital incident, when it was shrapnel. And if we dispute the Hamas figures, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that we've actually got the ratio under 1-to-1. But whether it's 1.5-to-1 or under 1-to-1, that ratio is off the charts.
Remarkable.
Historically. Certainly when you compare it to, I mean, the closest battle you can compare the Battle of Gaza to is the Battle of Mosul, where it's estimated that in order to kill an estimated 3,000 ISIS fighters, civilian casualties were around
10,000.
Around 10,000, and that's the closest. That's the closest. We have about 3-to-1. It's horrific. I don't like the phrase "good ratio," but how do you explain that the IDF has been able to achieve a civilian to combatant ratio that is far, far less catastrophic for civilians than any other military has been able to achieve in less challenging urban contexts?
I mean, this is part of the story of this war that I think people should be lining the streets to some extent and applauding the IDF and the
I don't want. I've had interviews where they ask, do you expect us to give you a pat on the back? No, I'm not expecting a pat on the back, but understand the unique challenge that Israel is facing.
But when you understand that this is a threat that Hamas poses Israel, is a threat that is posed by radical Islamic terror to the entire world, and the way we are prosecuting this war. So if they're not going to applaud, but to take us to The Hague on charges of genocide, have they lost their minds? This is the great problem of how this war is being portrayed. And it's unfortunate, it's sad, and we can keep on hammering away at this message. But I think where it all comes from is what we've been speaking about. Are these values, are these morals, are these Jewish ethics? But it's also in the way that we target. We don't just drop bombs. That CNN example, the buried lead, the diving, the gliding tactic, right? The use of PGMs, of precision-guided munitions, in numbers that are off the charts in terms of what percentage of your overall bombs are being used as PGMs. In the way...
Precision-guided munitions.
Precision-guided munitions. In the number,
for the muggles in the audience.
Right. In the number of how many munitions, as I spoke before, over 40,000 that the Air Force has dropped in the area of the Gaza Strip. All of this together paints a very clear picture that this is probably the most accurate and precision-guided war that has ever been fought in the history of mankind.
And yet, despite that, Israel comes under considerable international pressure to be more precise, be more precise. How are you assessing the evolution of Israel's military strategy in this war? We started in the northern Gaza Strip with an order to evacuate the entire population, a massive ground offensive. How did that change as the IDF reached the central camps and middle area of the Gaza Strip?
I mean, what you saw, for example, is in the beginning when Israel, first of all, moved so many people out of the northern Gaza. And with those flyers, with those phone calls, tens of thousands of phone calls to people's cell phones. Right? No other military does anything of that kind.
By the way, not just robocalls.
No.
Officers assigned to calling individuals in Arabic saying, please, for your own safety, get out of the way. Yeah. We don't want you to get hurt.
It's like that, the tactic that used to be used when you had plenty of time, the knock on the roof tactic that people would say, they would call you up and say, we're going to bomb your building because you're a Hamas guy and you have a Hamas command center in the house. So we need you to leave the home. I mean, again, don't you want to kill the Hamas guy in the home? But this is the way that Israel does, and we could say whether it's right or wrong, but that's just the way. So all of that was done in the north, pushing everyone down to the south. The devastation in the north was a direct result of how embedded Hamas was inside the infrastructure, the number of tunnels. I mean, we all know the stories of how there's not a home that you don't go into that has, many of them, a shaft that goes down and leads to a tunnel. Weapons, a paraphernalia of Hamas, but that might not be enough of its own. But all of this infrastructure being used by the terrorist organization.
Infrastructure 1.5 times the length of the London Underground or the New York subway. We're talking about 500 kilometers.
Of course.
Underground. Yeah. Embedded underground. And therefore you see the damage to structures above ground.
What people tend to not also realize is, they think, oh, you go into a home, you see a tunnel, blow up the tunnel. So what I've tried to explain to people is, okay, this tunnel could go for 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers. Now, it could go from this house that you're in to school 6 blocks away, then go and cut left to a hospital, and then go into a UN compound where some of those displaced Palestinians. So if you just fill it with explosives, right? I heard this number the other day. Do you know how many mines the engineering corps of the IDF has lined when it sometimes destroys buildings inside Gaza or tunnels?
No.
A number that I heard from a source in the IDF is about 600,000 mines that have been used inside Gaza. Now take that number and say to yourself, hold on, that is an astonishing amount of explosives. That is crazy. And again, you put that with the 40,000 bombs that have been dropped, and you say to yourself, how does all this make sense? How is anyone still standing in Gaza? But if you were to just mine that tunnel and blow it up, what will happen to the school and the hospital and that other home that it goes under?
They would all go kaboom.
So you can't do that. So you have to outline and map out the tunnel. You have to then make sure that every building that is above the tunnel before you destroy it is either evacuated or somehow will be able to stay and not capsize. Think of how complicated that is. It's not something, this is a tactic, this is a type of threat and challenge that no military has ever had to face.
Right, it's not just a question of bunker buster bombs from the air.
No.
Or mining the whole thing and sending it to Kingdom Come. They have to be very careful not to do excessive damage to civilian infrastructure.
Because if I know between these two lines, these two cups, there's a tunnel, and I drop a bunker buster, a small diameter bomb, a GBU-39 right here, and it will blow up, and part of that tunnel will capsize, but the rest of the tunnel network is still intact. So what did I exactly do? So I cut off this building to that building, but for all I know, there's another roundabout way that goes here. You have to map out this whole thing.
And how are they destroying the tunnels then?
So they're doing this, if you're an IDF unit that goes into a house and you identify a shaft, you don't go in. You have to call up special forces that they go in. They're specially trained to operate inside the tunnels. They go in using soldiers and robots to map out the tunnels. This takes a lot of time. Then you have to get your explosives inside. Then you have to be able to detonate. You have to clear out the route of it. This takes days. I mean, this is not something that happens just within minutes. It's not just dropping a bomb from the air. And this is a way that Israel prosecutes war that is unprecedented in modern, ancient, historic, whatever you want to say, warfare.
And is that method different in the central Gaza from what we saw in the north? What changed between those two battle zones?
I mean, we do have to recognize that Israel went into this war with faulty intelligence, right? We saw that play out on October 7th. We saw that play out with the length and how extensive the tunnel network was. We thought that
What was faulty about the intelligence?
Well, if you spoke to IDF officers prior to October 7th, they would have told you, yeah, there's about 200 kilometers of tunnels, or 250, and they would have told you that in May 2021, during Operation Guardian of the Walls, the last big operation in the famous metro bombing, that was amazing, and we took out this strategic asset. The Prime Minister said it, the Chief of Staff said it. We didn't really do much back in May of 2021. And their tunnel network is far greater and more extensive than anything that we would have imagined.
And far more extensive than any metro system Tel Aviv might ever hope to have.
That's also true. You had to learn on the fly and do something that the IDF has done over 76 years, or the Jewish people have done for even longer. It's called improvise and adapt. So you had to learn on the fly, how am I going to engage with this? Now, one of the things that we saw that was great fanfare in the international media, I know that you were asked about this probably a million times, we're pouring seawater into the tunnels, right? That was a story that everyone was talking about. It was an idea. It was tried. It was not effective, right? But this is one of those things that you try to do as you're figuring out, because you're facing something that you didn't know existed in that capacity. And there's no handbook, right? Elon, there's no book that you go into Amazon or into Barnes and Noble and you're like, oh, how do I destroy 500 miles of tunnels, right? That doesn't exist.
It hasn't been taught in any foreign military academies because no other military has had to do it. Another challenge that we have coming up, we're recording this podcast episode as Israel is warning that a ground offensive in Rafah is coming. Hamas started this war with 24 battalions. Last two are on their last legs in Khan Yunis. That leaves 4 in Rafah. And Israel is saying, we have to go into Rafah and dismantle those Hamas battalions because it would be otherwise like ending World War II by saying, well, let's let the Nazis keep Berlin. You don't put out 3/4 of a fire because a fire comes back. You put out the whole fire. And that's why Israel has to go into Rafah and has therefore been saying we want civilians to get out of the way so that they won't be harmed as we go and fight against the remainder of Hamas's terrorist army. Now, Israel has come under a lot of pressure from the United States not to do the sort of campaign in Rafah as in the north. United States trying to convince Israel to go for something more precise or targeted, or somehow pursue the joint goal of going after Hamas and bringing it down without actually going into Rafah and reaching them. Are there any alternatives from a military perspective to destroy the remainder of Hamas's terrorist army? The last quarter still on its feet, without a massive ground operation in Gaza. Is there some sort of precise solution?
No. And I could tell you what a senior member of the cabinet recently explained to me, the security cabinet. And I like this definition, this breakdown. What Israel has done very effectively in the north and in the central Gaza and in Khan Yunis is it broke the back. It hasn't eliminated Hamas. It hasn't yet defeated Hamas. But it broke the back of the Hamas terrorist army and took it from being an army and turned it into an organization.
Or rather, turned it from being organized terrorist battalions into what resembles more of a counterinsurgency guerrilla warfare.
So then, once you've done that big operation, now you can do these smaller scale operations, like what we saw in the Shifa hospital, as an example, that are the follow-up, the continuation, the maintenance that is required to prevent Hamas from arising again. In Rafah, because of the number of battalions, because of the extensive infrastructure, because of the mere fact that along the 14-kilometer strip of land known as the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Egypt and Gaza, where they have what I call their oxygen pipeline, those are the tunnels that they still maintain to smuggle in weapons from the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip, some of that sophisticated Iranian weaponry that they have. If we don't deal with that, choose your metaphor. I mean, like what you said, putting out the fire, leaving Berlin. We spoke about Mosul before. So I went, you look at the Bab Atwad. It's a real neighborhood in Mosul. Do we imagine that in 2017, as the US, the UK, and all these other nations are trying diligently to defeat ISIS, someone says, hey guys, that neighborhood, Bab Atwad, you can't go in there. Do we really think that they would have said, you know what, you're right, we should be a little more precise or accurate in isolated operations?
Well, obviously not, but they weren't facing the opprobrium of the international community. Correct. Because they were the international community. It was half of the sovereign nations in the world fighting ISIS
100%. But we have to do what will prevent Hamas from being able to pose a threat the likes of what it was prior to October 7th.
So no alternative in Rafah other than a big ground operation?
I don't see an alternative in Rafah. Now, how big does it have to be? Does it have to be 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks? These are numbers that I have heard. We're looking at something that is going to take several weeks to be able to break the back of those battalions, to eliminate as much of them as possible, to safeguard the civilians that are there, to do this in the same way that we've been prosecuting the war until now, with precision and accuracy. But this is in the interest of everyone. And that's unfortunately what the world is failing to understand.
One of the goals of this war is to bring to justice the Hamas terrorists responsible for October 7th. The Prime Minister has said since the beginning of the war, every Hamas terrorist is a dead man walking. Announced that we took out the number 3 in Hamas, Marwan Issa, warning number 2 and number 1 are next. President Herzog saying if we want to get the hostages back, we need to get our hands on Sinwar, alive or dead. And yet 6 months into the war, we haven't been able to get our hands on the mastermind with all of Israel's phenomenal intelligence, with all of its phenomenal precision capabilities. Why is it proving so difficult to apprehend Sinwar? I mean, if we could get our hands on Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal hiding in the jungles of Argentina, why is it so difficult to get Sinwar?
First of all, I don't have the intelligence information to know if we know where he is or if we do not know where he is. But let's play out both scenarios. Let's say, number 1, we don't know where he is. Very difficult. Lots of tunnels, as we spoke about. There have been reports, and I've spoken with some of these military officials, of how they felt like they were just always a week or two behind him in some of these tunnel networks complexes that they would get to, particularly in Khan Yunis. Is he still in Khan Yunis? Has he moved to Rafah now? Unclear. But let's also assume the possibility that Israel actually knows where he is. And it's not far-fetched to imagine this, because let's also remember, there are talks that take place in Doha about the hostages. You might say, what does that have to do with anything? Because then somehow they have to send messages back to Gaza, go to Sinwar, get his feedback, and send them back to the mediators in Doha. So there is signal intelligence that can be potentially obtained, surveillance intelligence that could see the courier who's potentially going somewhere. In other words, maybe it's possible, and I don't know, but maybe it's possible that we actually know where he is, but maybe he is surrounded by dozens of hostages. That is his insurance card. Now, then you have to ask yourself another question. And this is something that also the world has never dealt with. Think of the dilemmas that our military planners and our ministers have to grapple with almost on a daily basis. I might know where Sinwar is. I know he's surrounded by 15 hostages. Do I attack or do I not? I know where this hostage is, or I'm sorry, this terrorist is, but he has 2 hostages. Is that a number that I could attack? These are awful, unprecedented dilemmas. And that's even before we get into he's surrounded by family, he's surrounded by children, he's surrounded by civilians. These are inhumane dilemmas almost. And this is part, unfortunately, of the cynical use that Hamas makes. So I don't know if we know where he is or we don't know where he is, but in either of those options, these are very complicated realities.
And that's really such an important misconception, I find, with international media coverage, the thought that perhaps Israel has good options, when in fact we don't. We have only excruciating moral dilemmas. And throughout this whole war, I said, I'm glad I don't have to make any of these decisions. I just have to try to explain them. One of the big challenges in this war has been getting a hold of the hostages and trying to rescue them. And I've had journalists asking me with frustration, why haven't you been able to rescue more hostages? And then when they see the level of firepower that is needed to extract hostages from inside densely populated areas, when we got Fernando Simon Marman and Louis Har out, and there were reportedly many civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, they said, no, we wanted you to rescue the hostages, but not like that. We've managed to get 105 hostages out through the hostage release pause, the negotiated agreement. There was Ori Megidish, the soldier who was rescued in the early days of the war in unexplained circumstances. The 2 Argentinian Israeli hostages who were rescued in a very bold commando raid. But we've only, as some interviewers have told me, I think trying to rub salt into the wound, managed to rescue as many hostages as our forces have accidentally killed. The large majority got out as part of a negotiated agreement that at the moment Hamas doesn't seem to be interested in. Why is it so difficult to get the hostages out? If in the 70s the Israeli army was able to rescue hostages from an airport arrival hall in Entebbe, Uganda, why is it so difficult to get them out of Gaza?
Unfortunately, the reality of Gaza is is such that there is no happy ending like the 1976 Entebbe raid, right? You know, and unfortunately, when I hear that argument, by the way, about the hostages that we killed, those 3 who were unfortunately killed by IDF soldiers, I mean, it was a tragedy that, of course, no one, but that's the reality of what's happening in Gaza. It's so complicated. The fog of war is so thick. It's so difficult. Now, when you go into a tunnel network and those special troops from Sayeret Matkal or Yahalom or Shaldag or any of these special forces commando units go in there, think of your underground in pitch black. You're walking through. You don't know. Is there a booby trap? Is there a tripwire? Is it mined? Is there a terrorist waiting with RPG around the corner? And you're hoping that you will find a hostage. And unfortunately, they haven't been able to. But this is what the IDF has been focused on all the time. The way to also look at it from the other perspective is Israel has identified and given notification out of the 134 hostages that are still being held, about 35 around, if not more, that their loved ones are no longer among the living.
36 confirmed dead as of recording this podcast.
How do they find that out? How do they figure that out? They don't say much of how they figure it out. So it could be, you know, we could assume with some great confidence and certainty that they find forensic evidence. They go into homes, they find blood. They go into tunnels and they find a uniform that might have had a bullet hole and there might be blood there. They then will test that. They'll go and they'll find a Hamas terrorist who they might capture or kill, find a cell phone on him, take that cell phone, download the photographs and the videos that that person might have, who might have been one of those attackers on October 7th. This is an intelligence operation the likes of which Israel has essentially established a whole new intelligence agency that we don't really have a name for it yet. Because we have military intelligence, what's known by the Hebrew acronym Aman. We have the Shabak, the Shin Bet, which is to counter Palestinian terrorism. And we have the Mossad, which is like our equivalent of MI6 or CIA, overseas. We now have a whole new intelligence agency, sits in a building not far from here. We have hundreds of people who sit in their whole task, their whole job, is to try to find and locate, identify, figure out the status of every single one of those hostages.
And that means that as the war goes on, Israel is able to operate much more precisely because it's operating with much better intelligence than the beginning when we were largely flying blind.
For example, you mentioned Marwan Issa just before. When he was eliminated in that strike, what it took a while to figure out, was he actually killed, was he not killed? The chief IDF spokesperson, Brigadier General Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, said that we knew that there were now hostages that were with him. How did we know that? There is an amazing intelligence campaign here that is incredible in what Israel has done, that the world is also watching and listening. A lot of this cannot be publicized, cannot be revealed, because people's lives are on the line, right? But this idea as if Israel doesn't know what it's doing, or Israel has lost its glory, or Israel is... The question is really, why is Hamas still holding on to Ariel and Kfir Bibas? That's the question people should be asking. Not why can't Israel get them back? Why are these two beautiful red-headed boys still being held in the Gaza Strip?
So many stories still to be revealed and information to be exposed. I'm sure it'll make a fascinating subject of a book that maybe you will write one day. But for now, you're going to rush home and continue working on the book that you're writing now. Yaakov Katz, what's the book about? What can we expect? When is it out?
So the pivot that we kind of mentioned before, it's now going to focus more on, the working title is While Israel Slept, which you would probably know that Winston Churchill, between speeches that he gave, I think it was between 1931 and 1938, put together a book that had one title in the UK, but then when it was published in the US, While England Slept was the name that it was given, and basically ahead of the Nazi Germany and World War II. It's looking at, how did this happen? So not just at the night between October 6th and 7, when there were those fateful phone calls between the IDF chief of staff and the head of the Southern Command, and the SIM card story that we've all heard of by now, and the different indicators. Were there
this
alerts?
Being, for those who aren't familiar with the SIM card story,
Hamas, close to about 100 of them, changed the SIM cards in their phones from a Palestinian cellular network to an Israeli one that night, setting off a bit of an alarm within the intelligence community. Sadly, not enough to get the IDF to stand at the ready and be on a higher level of alert to prevent...
At least evacuate the Nova Festival.
Right, but there were a number of these alerts, but it's actually going back in time and looking at all of the different indicators that were there, the writing that might have been on the wall. Now, it's very easy to say that today, but it's looking at more of this policy, because you could see it happening again, Elon. Right? You could see how strategic blindness can once again settle in, how a policy of containment, when it comes to threats that we face, can once again become the standing policy of a government. So it's looking back and trying to outline, how did this happen over a long period of years?
And with the benefit of hindsight, read that writing that was on the wall.
Correct.
Okay.
And hopefully prevent it from happening again.
Because never again means never again. Yaakov Katz, thank you very much for coming on State of a Nation.
Thank you, Elon.
And that's it for today's episode of State of a Nation with former Jerusalem Post editor-in-chief Yaakov Katz. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And we'll be back soon with more in-depth insider conversations. Thank you for joining us.